Jean Gourdon's 4 Days by Emile Zola. Spring. On that particular day, at about 5 o'clock in the morning, the sun entered the delightful abruptness into the little room I occupied at the house of my uncle Lazare, parish priest of the hamlet of Douglas. A broad yellow ray fell upon Ray closed eyelids, and I woke in light. My room, which was whitewashed and had deal furniture, was full of attractive gaiety. I went to the window and gazed at the Durance, which traced its broad course amidst the dark green verdure of the valley. Fresh puffs of wind caressed my face, and the murmur of the trees and river seemed to call me to them. I gently opened my door. To get out, I had to pass through my uncle's room. I proceeded on tiptoe, fearing the creaking of my thick boots might awaken the worthy man, who was still slumbering with a smiling countenance, and I trembled at the sound of the church bell tolling the Angelus. For some days past, my uncle Lazare had been following me about everywhere, looking sad and annoyed. He would perhaps have prevented me going over there to the edge of the river, and hiding myself among the willows on the bank, so as to watch for Babette passing, that tall dark girl who had come with the spring. But my uncle was sleeping soundly. I felt something like remorse in deceiving him and running away in this manner. I stayed for an instant and gazed on his calm countenance with its gentle expression enhanced by rest. I recalled to mind with feeling the day when he had come to fetch me in the chilly and deserted home which my mother's funeral was leaving. Since that day, what tenderness, what devotedness, what good advice he had bestowed on me. He had given me his knowledge and kindness, all his intelligence, and all his heart. I was tempted for a moment to cry out to him, "Get up, Uncle Lazare. Let us go for a walk together along the path you are so fond of besides the Durance. You'll enjoy the fresh air and the morning sun. You'll see what an appetite you will have on your return." And Babette, who was going down to the river in her light morning gown, and whom I should not be able to see. My uncle would be there. I would have to lower my eyes. It would be so nice under the willows, lying flat on one's stomach. In the fine grass, I felt a languid feeling creeping over me, and slowly taking short steps, holding my breath, I reached the door. I went downstairs and began running like a madcap in the delightful warm May morning air. The sky was quite white on the horizon, with exquisitely delicate blue and pink tints. The pale sun seemed like a great silver lamp, casting a shower of bright rays into the Durance, and the broad sluggish river, expanding lazily over the red sand, extended from one end of the valley to the other, like a stream of liquid metal to the west. A line of low rugged hills threw slight violet streaks on the pale sky. I've been living in this out-of-the-way corner for 10 years. How often had I kept my uncle Lazare waiting to give me my Latin lesson. The worthy man wanted to make me learned, but I was on the other side of the Durance, fretting about magpies, discovering a hill which I had not yet climbed. Then on my return there were remonstrances. The Latin was forgotten. My poor uncle scolded me for having torn my trousers, and he shuddered when he noticed sometimes that the skin underneath was cut. The valley was mine, really mine. I had conquered it with my legs, and I was the real landlord by right of friendship. And that bit of river, those 2 leagues of the Durance, how I loved them, how well we understood one another when together. I knew all the whims of my dear stream, its anger, its charming ways, its different features at each hour of the day. When I reached the water's edge on that particular morning, I felt something like giddiness at seeing it so gentle and so white. It had never looked so gay. I slipped rapidly beneath the willows, to an open space where a broad patch of sunlight fell on the dark grass. There I laid me down on my stomach, listening, watching the pathway by which Babette would come through the branches. Oh, how sound Uncle Lazare must be sleeping, I thought. I extended myself at full length on the moss. The sun struck gentle heat into my back, whilst my breath, buried in the grass, was quite cool. Have you never examined the turf at close quarters, with your eyes on the blades of grass? Whilst I waited for Babette, I pried indiscreetly into a tuft, which was really a whole world. In my bunch of grass there were streets, crossroads, public squares, entire cities. At the bottom of it I distinguished a great dark patch, where the shoots of the previous spring were decaying sadly. Then slender stalks were growing up, stretching out, and bending into the multitude of elegant forms, and producing frail colonnades, churches, virgin forests. I saw, too, lean insects wandering in the midst of the immensity. The poor children were certainly lost, for they went from colonnade to colonnade, from street to street, in a frightened, anxious way. It was just at this moment that, on raising my eyes, I saw Babette's white skirts standing out against the dark ground at the top of the pathway. I recognized her printed calico gown, which was gray, and small blue flowers. I sunk down deeper in the grass. I heard my heart thumping against the earth, and almost raising me with slight jerks. My breast was burning now. I no longer felt the freshness of the dew. The young girl came nimbly down the pathway, her skirt skimming the ground with a swinging motion that charmed me. I saw her at full length, quite erect, in her proud and happy gracefulness. She had no idea I was behind the willows. She walked with a light step. She ran without giving a thought to the wind, which slightly raised her gown. I could distinguish her feet, trotting along quickly, with a piece of her white stockings, which was perhaps as large as one hand, and which she made me blush in a manner that was alike sweet and painful. Oh, then, I saw nothing else, neither the Durants, nor the willows, nor the whiteness of the sky. What cared I for the valley? It was no longer my sweetheart. I was quite indifferent to its joy and sadness. What cared I for my friends, the stories and the trees and the hills? The river could run away all at once, if it liked. I would not have regretted it. And the spring, I did not care a bit about the spring. Had it borne away, the sun had warmed my back, its leaves, its rays, all its May morning. I should have remained there, in ecstasy, gazing at Babette, running along the pathway and swinging her skirts deliciously, for Babette had taken the valley's place in my heart. Babette was the spring. I had never spoken to her. Both of us blushed when we met one another in my uncle Lazare's church. I could have vowed she detested me. She talked on that particular day for a few minutes with the women who were washing. The sound of her pearly laughter reached as far as me, mingled with the loud voice of the Durants. Then she stooped down to take a little water in the hollow of her hand. But the bank was high, and Babette, who was on the point of slipping, saved herself by clutching the grass. I gave a frightful shudder, which made my blood run cold. I rose hastily, and without feeling ashamed, without reddening, ran to the young girl. She cast a startled look at me, and she began to smile. I bent down, at the risk of falling. I succeeded in filling my right hand with water by keeping my fingers close together, and I presented this new sort of cup to Babette, asking her to drink. The women who were washing laughed. Babette, confused, did not dare accept. She hesitated and half turned her head away. At last she made up her mind, and delicately pressed her lips to the tips of my fingers, but she had waited too long. All the water had run away. Then she burst out laughing. She became a child again, and I saw very well that she was making fun of me. I was very silly. I bent forward again. This time I took the water in both hands and hastened to put them to Babette's lips. She drank, and I felt the warm kiss of her mouth run up my arms to my breast, which it filled with heat. Oh, how my uncle must sleep, I murmured to myself. Just as I said that, I perceived a dark shadow beside me, and having turned around, I saw my Uncle Azaire in person a few paces away, watching Babette and me, as if offended. His cassock appeared quite white in the sun. In his look I saw reproaches which made me feel inclined to cry. Babette was very much afraid. She turned quite red and hurried off, stammering, "Thanks, Monsieur Jean. I thank you very much." As for me, wiping my wet hands, I stood motionless and confused before my Uncle Azaire. The worthy man, with folded arms and bringing back a corner of the cassock, watched Babette, who was running up the pathway without turning her red. And when she had disappeared behind the hedges, he lowered his eyes to me, and I saw his pleasant countenance smile sadly. "Jean," he said to me, "come into the broad walk. Breakfast is not ready. We have half an hour to spare." He set out with his rather heavy tread, avoiding the tufts of grass wet with dew. Part of the bottom of his cassock that was dragging along the ground made a dull cracking sound. He held his breviary under his arm, and he had forgotten his morning lecture, and he advanced dreamily and bowed his head, without uttering a word. His silence tormented me. He was generally so talkative. My anxiety increased at each step. He had certainly seen me giving Babette water to drink. What a sight, O Lord! The young girl, laughing and blushing, kissed the tips of my fingers, whilst I, standing on tiptoe, stretching out my arms, was leaning forward as if to kiss her. My action now seemed to me frightfully audacious, and all my timidity returned. I inquired of myself how could I have dared to have my fingers kissed so sweetly. And my Uncle Azaire, who said nothing, who continued walking with short steps in front of me, without giving a single glance at the old trees he loved. He was assuredly preparing a sermon. He was only taking me into the broad walk to scold me at his ease. It would occupy at least an hour. Breakfast would get cold, and I would be able to return to the water's edge and dream of the warm burns that Babette's lips had left on my hands. We were in the broad walk. This walk, which was wide and short, ran beside the river. It was shaded by enormous oak trees, with trunks lacerated by seams stretching out their great tall branches. The fine grass spread like a carpet beneath the trees, and the sun riddled the foliage, embroidered this carpet with a lustrous pattern of gold. In the distance, all around, extended raw green meadows. My uncle went to the bottom of the walk, without altering his step, without turning around. Once there, he stopped, and I kept beside him, understanding that the terrible moment had arrived. The river made a sharp curve. A low parapet at the end of the walk formed a sort of terrace. The vault of shade opened on a valley of light. The country expanded wide before us for several leagues. The sun was rising in the heavens, where the silvery rays of the morning had become transformed into a stream of gold. Blinding floods of light ran from the horizon, along the hills, spread out into the plain of the glare of fire. After a moment's silence, my Uncle Azaire turned towards me. Good heavens, the sermon, I thought. I bowed my head. My uncle pointed out the valley to me with an expansive gesture, and drawing himself up, he said slowly, "Look, Jean, there is the spring. The earth is full of joy, my boy, and I have brought you here opposite this plain of light to show you the first smiles of the young season. Observe what brilliancy and sweetness. Warm perfumes rise from the country and pass across our faces like puffs of life." He was silent and seemed dreaming. I had raised my head, astonished, breathing at ease. My uncle was not preaching. "It is a beautiful morning," he continued, "a morning of youth. Your 18 summers find full enjoyment amidst this verdure which is at most 18 days old. All this great brightness and perfume it is not. The broad valley seems to you a delightful place. The river is there to give you its freshness, the trees to lend you their shade, the whole country to speak to you of tenderness, the heavens themselves to kiss those horizons, that you are searching with hope and desire. The spring belongs to fellows of your age. It is it that teaches the boys how to give young girls to drink. I hung my head again. My uncle Lazaire had certainly seen me. An old fellow like me, he continued, unfortunately knows what trust to place in the charms of spring. I, my poor Jean, I love the Durance because it waters these meadows and gives life to all the valley. I love this young foliage because it proclaims to me the coming of the fruits of summer and autumn. I love the sky because it is good to us, because its warmth hastens the fecundity of the earth. I should have had to tell you this one day or another. I prefer telling it to you now, at this hour. It is the spring itself that is giving you a lesson. The earth is a vast workshop, wherein there is never a slack season. Observe this flower at our feet. To you it is a perfume, to me it is labor. It accomplishes its tasks by producing its share of life, a little black seed which will work in its turn next spring. And now, search the vast horizon. All this joy is but the act of generation. If the country be smiling, it is because it's the beginning of the everlasting task again. Do you hear me now? Breathing hard, full of activity and haste. The leaves sigh, the flowers are in a hurry, the corn grows without pausing, all the plants, all the herbs are quarreling as to which shall spring up the quickest. And the running water, the river, comes to assist in the common labor, and the young sun which rises in the heavens is entrusted with the duty of enlivening the everlasting task of the laborers. At this point my uncle made me look him straight in the face. He concluded in these terms: Jean, you hear what your friend, the spring, says to you. He is youth, but he is preparing ripe again. He is preparing ripe age. His bright smile, is but the gaiety of labor. Summer will be powerful, autumn bountiful, for the spring is singing at the moment, while courageously performing its work. I looked very stupid. I understood my uncle Lazaire. He was positively preaching me a sermon, which he told me I was an idle fellow, and that the time had come to work. My uncle appeared as much embarrassed as myself. After having hesitated for some instants, he said, slightly stammering, Jean, you were wrong not to have come and told me all, as you love Babette, and Babette loves you. Babette loves me, I explained. My uncle made me an ill-humored gesture. Allow me to speak. I don't want another avowal. She owed it to me herself. She owed that to you. She owed that to you. I suddenly threw my arms round my uncle Lazaire's neck. Oh, how nice that is, I added. I had never spoken to her. Truly, she told you that at the confessional, didn't she? I would never have dared ask her if she loves me, and I would never have known anything. Oh, how I thank you. My uncle Lazaire was quite red. He felt that he had committed a blunder. He had imagined that this was not my first meeting with the young girl, and there he gave me a certainty, when as yet I only dared dream of hope. He held his tongue now. It was I who spoke with volubility. I understand you, I continued. You are right. I must work to win Babette. But you will see how courageous I shall be. Ah, how good you are, my uncle Lazaire. How well you speak. I understand what the spring says. I also will have powerful summer and an autumn of abundance. One is well placed there. One sees all the valley. I am young like it. I feel youth within me demanding to accomplish its task. My uncle calmed me. Very good, Jean, he said to me. I had long hoped to make a priest of you, and I imparted to you my knowledge with that sole aim. But what I saw this morning at the waterside compels me to definitely give up my fondest hope. It is heaven that disposes of us. You will love the Almighty in another way. You cannot now remain in this village, and I only wish you to return when ripened by age and work. I have chosen the trade of printer for you. Your education will serve you. One of my friends who is a printer at Grenoble is expecting you next Monday. I felt anxious. "And I shall come back and marry Babette?" I inquired. My uncle smiled imperceptibly, and, without answering in a direct manner, said, "The remainder is the will of heaven. You are heaven, and I have faith in your kindness." "Oh, uncle, see that Babette does not forget me. I will work for her." Then my uncle Lazare again pointed out to me the valley, which the warm golden light was overspreading more and more. "There is hope," he said to me. "Do not be as old as I am, Jean. Forget my sermon. Be as ignorant as the land. It does not trouble about the autumn. It is all engrossed with the joy of its smile. It labors courageously. Without a care it hopes." As we returned to the parsonage, strolling along slowly in the grass, which was scorched by the sun, and chatting with concern of our approaching separation. Breakfast was cold, as I had foreseen, but that did not trouble me much. I had tears in my eyes each time I looked at my uncle Lazare, and at the thought of Babette, my heart beat fit to choke me. I do not remember what I did during the remaining of the day. I think I went and lay down under the willows at the riverside. My uncle was right. The earth was at work. On placing my ear to the grass, I seemed to hear continuous sounds, and I dreamed of what my life would be, buried in the grass until nightfall. I arranged an existence full of labor, divided between Babette and my uncle Lazare. The energetic youthfulness of the soil had penetrated my breast, which I pressed with force against the common mother, and at times I imagined myself to be one of the strong willows that lived around me. In the evening I could not dine. My uncle, no doubt, understood the thoughts that were choking me, for he feigned not to notice my want of appetite. As soon as I was able to rise from table, I hastened to return and breathe the open air outside. A fresh breeze rose from the river, the dull splashing of which I heard in the distance. A soft light fell from the sky. The valley expanded, peaceful and transparent, like a dark shoreless ocean. There were vague sounds in the air, a sort of impassioned tremor, like a great flapping of wings passing above my head. Penetrating perfumes rose with cool air from the grass. I had gone out to see Babette. I knew she came to the parsonage every night, and I went and placed myself in ambush behind a hedge. I had got rid of my timidness in the morning, and considered it quite natural to be waiting for her there, because she loved me and I had to tell her of my departure. When I perceived her skirts in the limpid night, I advanced noiselessly. Then I murmured, in a low voice, "Babette, Babette, I am here." She did not recognize me at first, and started with fright. When she discovered who I was, she seemed still more frightened, which very much surprised me. "It's you, Monseigneur Jean," she said to me. "What are you doing there? What do you want?" I was beside her and took her hand. "You love me fondly, do you not?" "I? Who told you that?" "My uncle is there." She stood there in confusion. Her hand began to tremble in mine, as she was on the point of running away. I took her other hand. We were face to face, in a sort of hollow in the hedge. I felt Babette's panting breath running all warm over my face. The freshness of the air, the rustling silence of the night hung around us. "I don't know," stammered the young girl. "I never said that. His reverence the curé misunderstood. For mercy's sake, let me be. I am in a hurry." "No, no," I continued. "I want you to know that I am going away tomorrow, and to promise to love me always." "You are leaving tomorrow?" Oh, that sweet cry! How tenderly Babette uttered it! I seemed still to hear its apprehensive voice full of affliction and love. "You see," I explained in my turn, "that my uncle Lazare said the truth. Besides, he never tells fibs. You love me, Babette. Your lips this morning confided the secret very softly to my fingers, and I made her sit down at the foot of the hedge. My memory has retained my first chat of love in its absolute innocence. Babette listened to me like a little sister. She was no longer afraid. She told me the story of her love, and there were solemn sermons, ingenious avowals, projects without end. She vowed she would marry no one but me. I vowed to deserve her hand by labor and tenderness. There was a cricket behind the hedge, who accompanied our chat with his chaunt of hope. and all the valley, whispering in the dark, took pleasure in hearing us talk so softly. On separating, we forgot to kiss each other. When I returned to my little room, it appeared to me that I had left it for at least a year. That day, which was so short, seemed an eternity of happiness. It was the warmest and most sweetly scented spring day of my life, and the remembrance of it now, like the distant faltering voice of my youth. Summer. When I woke at about 3 o'clock in the morning on that particular day, I was lying on the hard ground, tired out, with my face bathed in perspiration. The hot, heavy atmosphere of a July night weighed me down. My companions were sleeping around me, wrapping in their hooded cloaks. They speckled the gray ground with black, and the obscure plain panted. I fancied I heard the heavy breathing of a slumbering multitude, indistinct sounds, the neighing of horses, the clash of arms, rang out amidst the rustling silence. The army had halted at about midnight. We had received orders to lie down and sleep. We had been marching for 3 days, scorched by the sun that blinded by dust. The enemy were at length in front of us, over there, over the hills and the horizon. At daybreak, a decisive battle would be fought. I had been a victim to despondency. For 3 days I had been as if trampled upon, without energy, without the thought of the future. It was the excessive fatigue, indeed, that had just awakened me. Now lying on my back, with my eyes wide open, I was thinking, whilst gazing into the night. I thought of this battle, this butchery, which the sun was about to light up. For more than 6 years, the first shot in each night, I had been saying goodbye to those I loved most fondly, Babette and Uncle Lazaire, and now barely a month before my discharge, I had to say goodbye again, but this time perhaps forever. And my thoughts softened. With closed eyelids, I saw Babette and my Uncle Lazaire. How long it was since I had kissed them. I remembered the day of our separation, my uncle weeping because he was poor, and allowing me to leave like that, and Babette, in the evening, had vowed she would wait for me, and she would never love another. I had had to quit all, my master at Grenoble, my friends at Dugues. A few letters had come from time to time to tell me they always loved me, and that happiness was awaiting me in my well-beloved valley. And I was going to fight. I was going to get killed. I began dreaming of my return. I saw my poor old uncle on the threshold of the parsonage, extending his trembling arms, and behind him was Babette, quite red, smiling through her tears. I fell into the arms and kissed them, seeking for expressions. Suddenly the beating of drums recalled me to stern reality. Daybreak had come. The gray plain expanded in the morning mist. The ground became full of life. Indistinct forms appeared on all sides. A sound that became louder and louder filled the air. It was the call of bugles, the galloping of horses, the rumble of artillery, the shouting of orders. War came threatening. Amidst my dream of tenderness, I rose with difficulty. It seemed to me that my bones were broken, and that my head was about to split. I hastily got my men together, for I must tell you that I had won the rank of sergeant. We soon received orders to bear to the left and occupy a hillock above the plain. As we were about to move, the sergeant major came running along and shouting, "A letter to Sergeant Gourdon," and he handed me a dirty crumpled letter, which had been lying perhaps for a week in the leather bags of the post office. I had only just time to recognize the writing of my Uncle Lazaire. "Forward, march," shouted the major. I had to march. For a few seconds I held the poor letter in my hand, devouring it with my eyes. It burnt my fingers. I would have given it everything in the world to have sat down and wept at ease while reading it. I had to content myself with slipping it under my tunic against my heart. I had never experienced such agony. By way of consolation, I said to myself what my uncle had so often repeated to me. I was in the summer of my life, at the moment of the fierce struggle, and it was essential that I should perform my duty bravely, if I would have peaceful and bountiful autumn. But these reasons exasperated me the more. This letter, which had come to speak to me of happiness, burnt my heart, which had revolted against the folly of war, and I could not even read it. I was perhaps going to die without knowing what it contained, without perusing my Uncle Lazaire's affectionate remarks for the last time. We reached the top of the hill. We were to await orders here to advance. The battlefield had been marvelously chosen to slaughter one another at ease. The immense plain expanded for several leagues, and was quite bare, without a house or tree. Hedges and bushes made slight spots of the whiteness of the ground. I had never since seen such a country, an ocean of dust, a chalky soil, bursting open here and there, and displaying its tawny bowels, and never have I since witnessed a sky of such intense purity, a July day so lovely and so warm. At 8 o'clock the sultry heat was already scorching our faces. Oh, the splendid morning! And what a sterile plain to kill and die on! Firing had broken out with irregular crackling sounds, a long time since, supported by the solemn growl of the cannon. The enemy Austrians, dressed in white, had quitted the heights, and the plain was studded with long files of men, who looked to me about as big as insects. One might have thought it was an anthill insurrection. Clouds of smoke hung out over the battlefield. At times when these clouds were broke asunder, I perceived soldiers in flight, smitten with terrified panic. Thus there were currents of fright which bore men away, and outbursts of shame and courage which brought them back under fire. I could neither hear the cries of the wounded, nor see the blood flow. I could only distinguish the dead which the battalions left behind them, which resembled black patches. I began to watch the movements of the troops curiously, irritated at the smoke which hid a good half of the show, experiencing a sort of egotistic pleasure at the knowledge that I was in security, whilst others were dying. At about 9 o'clock we were ordered to advance. We went down the hill at the double and proceeded towards the center, which was giving away. The regular beat of our footsteps appeared to me funeral-like, the bravest among us panting, pale, and with haggard features. I have made up my mind to tell the truth. At the first whistle of the bullets, the battalion suddenly came to a halt, tempted to fly. Forward, forward, shouted the chiefs, but we were riveted to the ground, bowing our heads when a bullet whistled by our ears. This movement is instinctive. If shame had not restrained me, I would have thrown myself flat on my stomach in the dust. Before us was a huge veil of smoke, which we dared not penetrate. Red flashes passed through the smoke, and shuddering we stood still. But the bullets reached us. Soldiers fell with yells. The chiefs shouted louder, "Forward, forward!" The rear ranks, which they pushed on, compelled us to march. Then closing our eyes, we made a fresh dash and entered the smoke. We were seized with furious rage. When the cry of "Halt!" resounded, we experienced difficulty in coming to a standstill. As soon as one is motionless, fear returns, and one feels a wish to run away. Firing commenced, and we shot in front of us, without aiming, finding some relief in discharging bullets into the smoke. I remember I pulled my trigger mechanically, with lips firmly set together and eyes wide open. I was no longer afraid, for, to tell the truth, I no longer knew if I existed. The only idea I had in my head was that I would continue firing until all was over. My companion on the left received a bullet full in the face and fell on me. I brutally pushed him away, wiping my cheek, which had been drenched with blood, and I resumed firing. I still remember having seen our colonel, de Montevert, firm and erect upon his horse, gazing quietly towards the enemy. That man appeared to me immense. He had no rifle to amuse himself with, and his breast was expanded to its full breadth above us. From time to time he looked down, and exclaimed in a dry voice, "Close the ranks, close the ranks." We closed our ranks like sheep, treading on the dread, stupefied and continuing firing. Until then the enemy had only sent us bullets. A dull explosion was heard, and a shell carried off 5 of our men. A battery which must have been opposite of us which we could not see, had just opened fire. The shell struck in the middle of us, almost at one spot, making a sanguinary gap which we closed unceasingly with the obstinacy of ferocious brutes. Close the ranks, the colonel coldly repeated. We were giving the cannon human flesh. Each time a soldier was struck down, I was taking a step nearer death. I was approaching the spot where the shells were falling heavily. Crushing the men who turned had come to die. The corpses were forming heaps in that place, and soon the shells would strike into nothing more than a mound of mangled flesh. Sheds of limbs flew about at each fresh discharge. We could no longer close the ranks. The soldiers yelled, and the chiefs themselves were moved. With the bayonet, and amidst a shower of bullets the battalion rushed in fury towards the shells. The veil of smoke was torn asunder. We perceived the enemy's battery flaming red, which was firing on us from the mouths of all its pieces, on the summit of a hillock. But the dash forward had commenced. The shells stopped the dead only. I ran beside Colonel Montravert, whose horse had been killed, and who was fighting like a simple soldier. Suddenly I was struck down. It seemed to me my breast opened, and my shoulder was taken away. A frightful wind passed over my face, and I fell. The colonel fell beside me. I felt myself dying. I thought of those I loved, and fainted while searching with a withering hand for my Uncle Lazaire's letter. When I came to myself again, I was lying on my side in the dust. I was annihilated by profound stupor. I gazed before me with my eyes wide open without seeing anything. It seemed to me that I had lost my limbs, and that my brain was empty. I did not suffer, for life seemed to have departed from my flesh. The rays of a hot, implacable sun fell upon my face like molten lead. I did not feel it. Life returned to me little by little. My limbs became lighter. My shoulder alone remained crushed beneath an enormous weight. Then, with the instinct of a wounded animal, I wanted to sit up. I uttered a cry in pain, and fell back upon the ground. But I lived now. I saw. I understood. The plain spread out naked and deserted, all white, in the broad sunlight. It exhibited its desolation between the intense serenity of heaven. Heaps of corpses were sleeping in the warmth, and the trees had been brought down. Seemed to be other dead who were dying. There was not a breath of air. A frightful silence came from those piles of inanimate bodies. And at times there were dismal groans which broke the silence and conveyed a long tremor to it. Slender clouds of gray smoke hanging over the hills on the horizon was all that broke the bright blue of sky. The butchery was continuing on the heights. I imagined we were conquerors, and I experienced selfish pleasure in thinking I could die in one piece on this deserted plain. Around me the earth was black. On raising my head, I saw the enemy's battery on which we had charged, a few feet away from me. The struggle must have been horrible. The mound was covered with hacked and disfigured bodies. Blood had flowed so abundantly that the dust seemed like a large red carpet. The cannon stretched out their dark muzzles above the corpses. I shuddered when I observed the silence of those guns. Then gently, with a multitude of precautions, I succeeded in turning on my stomach. I rested my head on a large stone, all splashed with gore, and drew my Uncle Lazaire's letter from my breast. I placed it before my eyes, but my tears prevented me reading it. And whilst the sun was roasting me in the back, the acrid smell of blood was choking me. I could form an idea of the woeful plain around me, and was as if stiffened with rigidness of the dead. My poor heart was weeping in the warm, loathsome silence of murder. Uncle Lazaire wrote to me, "My dear boy, I hear war has been declared, but I still hope you will get your discharge before campaign opens. Every morning I beseech the Almighty to spare you new dangers. He will grant my prayer. He will one of these days let you close my eyes. Ah, my poor Jean, I am becoming old. I have great need of your arm. Since your departure I no more feel your youthfulness besides me, which gave me back my 20 summers. Do you remember our strolls in the morning along the oak tree walk? Now I no longer dare to go beneath those trees. I am alone. I am afraid. The Durance weeps. Come quickly and console me. Assuage my anxiety. The tears were choking me. I could not continue. At that moment, a heartening cry was uttered a few steps away from me. I saw a soldier suddenly rise with the muscles of his face contracted. He extended his arms in agony and fell to the ground, where he writhed in frightful convulsions, and he ceased moving. I have placed my hope in the Almighty, continued my uncle. He will bring you back safe and sound to Dorgaz, and we will resume a peaceful existence. Let me dream out loud, and tell you my plans for the future. You will go no more to Grenoble. You will remain with me. I'll make my child a son of the soil, a peasant who shall live gaily whilst tilling the fields, and I will retire to your farm. In a short time my trembling hands will no longer be able to hold the host. I only ask heaven for 2 years of such an existence. That will be my reward for a few good deeds I may have done. Then you will sometimes lead me along the paths of our dear valley, where every rock, every hedge will remind me of your youth, which I so greatly loved. I had to stop again. I felt such a sharp pain in my shoulder that I almost fainted a second time. A terrible anxiety had just taken possession of me. It seemed as if the sound of the fusillade was approaching, and I thought with terror that our army was perhaps retreating, and that in its flight it would descend to the plain and pass over my body. But I saw nothing but a slight cloud of smoke hanging over the low hills. My uncle is there added, and we shall be free to love one another. Ah, my well-beloved Jean, how right you were to give her to drink that morning beside the Durance. I was afraid of Babette. I was ill-humoured, and now I am jealous. For I can see very well that I shall never be able to love you as much as she does. Tell him, she repeated to me yesterday, blushing, that if he gets killed I shall go and throw myself into the river at the spot where he gave me to drink. For the love of God, be careful of your life. There are things that I cannot understand, but I feel that happiness awaits you here. I already call Babette my daughter. I can see her on your arm in the church. When I shall bless your union, I wish that to be my last mass. Babette is a fine, tall girl now. She will assist you in your work. The sound of the fusillade had gone farther away. I was weeping sweet tears. There were dismal moans among soldiers who were in their last agonies between the cannon wheels. I perceived one who was endeavoring to get rid of a comrade, wounded as if he was, whose body was crushing his chest, and as this wounded man struggled and complained, the soldier pushed him brutally away and made him roll down the slope of the mound, whilst that wretched creature, yelling with pain, and that cry of murmur came from the heap of the corpses. The sun, which was sinking, shed rays of light fallow color. The blue of the sky was softer. I finished reading my uncle Lazaire's letter. I simply wished, he continued, to give you news of ourselves, and to beg you to come as soon as possible and make us happy. And here I am weeping and gossiping like an old child. Hope, my poor Jean, I pray, and God is good. Answer me quickly and give me, if possible, the date of your return. Babette and I are counting the weeks. We trust to see you soon and hopeful. The day of my return I kissed the letter, sobbing, and fancied for a moment that I was kissing Babette and my uncle. No doubt I should never see them again. I would die like a dog in the dust, beneath the leaden sun. And it was on the desolated plain, amidst the death rattle of the dying, that those whom I loved dearly were saying goodbye. A buzzing silence filled my ears. I gazed at the pale earth spotted with blood, which extended deserted to the gray lines of the horizon. I repeated, I must die. Then I closed my eyes and thought of Babette and my uncle Lazare. I know not how long I remained in a sort of painful drowsiness. My heart suffered as much as my flesh. Warm tears ran slowly down my cheeks amidst the nightmare that accompanied the fever. I heard a moan similar to the continuous plaintive cry of a child in its suffering. At times I awoke and stared in the sky in astonishment. At last I understood that it was de Montevert's lying a few paces off, who was moaning in this manner. I had thought him dead. He was stretched out, with his face to the ground, his arms extended. This man had been good to me. I said to myself that I could not allow him to die thus. With his face on the ground, I began crawling slowly towards him. 2 corpses separated us. For a moment I thought of passing over the stomachs of these dead men to shorten the distance, for my shoulder made me suffer frightfully at every moment. But I did not dare. I proceeded on my knees, assisting myself with one hand. When I reached the colonel, I gave a sigh of relief. It seemed to me that I was less alone. We would die together, and this death shared by both of us no longer terrified me. I wanted him to see the sun, and I turned him over as gently as possible. When the rays fell upon his face, he breathed hard. He opened his eyes, leaning over his body. I tried to smile at him. He closed his eyelids again. I understood by the trembling lips that he was conscious of his sufferings. "It's you, Gourdon," he said to me at last, in a feeble voice. "Is the battle won?" "I think so, Colonel," I answered him. There was a moment of silence. Then, opening his eyes and looking at me, he inquired, Where are you wounded?" "In the shoulder. And you, Colonel?" "My elbow must be smashed. I remember. It was the same bullet that arraigned us both like this, my boy." He made an effort to sit up. "But come," he said with a sudden gaiety, "we are not going to sleep here." You cannot believe how much this courageous display of joviality contributed towards giving me strength and hope. I felt quite different, since we were to struggle against death. "Wait," I exclaimed. "I'll bandage up your arm with my handkerchief, and we will try and support one another as far as the nearest ambulance. That's it, my boy. Don't make it too tight. Now, let us take each other by the good hand and try to get up." We rose staggering. We had lost a great deal of blood. Our heads were swimming and our legs failed us. Any one would have mistaken us for drunkards, stumbling, supporting, pushing one another, and making zigzags to avoid the dead. The sun was setting with a rosy blush. Our gigantic shadows danced in a strange way over the field of battle. It was the end of a fine day. The colonel joked. His lips were crisped by shudders. His laughter resembled sobs. I could see that we were going to fall down in some corner, never to rise again. At times we were seized with giddiness and were obliged to stop and close our eyes. The ambulances formed small gray patches on the dark ground at the extremity of the plain. We knocked up against a large stone. We were thrown down, one on the other. The colonel swore like a pagan. We tried to walk on all fours, catching hold of the briars. In this way we did 100 yards on our knees, but our knees were bleeding. "I have had enough of it, and the colonel," said the colonel, lying down. "They may come and fetch me if they will. Let us sleep." I still had the strength to sit half up and shout with all the breath that remained within me. Men were passing along in the distance, picking up the wounded. They ran to us and placed us side by side on a stretcher. "Comrade," the colonel said to me during the journey, "death will not have us. I owe you my life. I will pay my debt. Whenever you have need of me, give me your hand." I placed my hand in his, and it was thus that we reached the ambulances. They had lighted the torches. The surgeons were cutting and sawing. Amidst frightful yells, a sickly smell came from the blood-stained linen, whilst the torches cast dark rosy flakes into the basins. The colonel bore the amputation of his arm with courage. I only saw his lips turn pale, and a film come over his eyes. When it was my turn, a surgeon examined my shoulder. "A shell did that for you," he said. "An inch lower, and your shoulder would have been carried away. The flesh only has suffered." And when I asked the assistant who was dressing my wound whether it was serious, he answered me with a laugh. "Serious? You will have to keep to your bed for 3 weeks and make new blood." I turned my face to the wall, not wishing to show my tears, and with my heart's eyes I perceived Babette and my uncle as there, stretching out their arms towards me. I had finished with this sanguinary struggles of my summer day. Autumn. It was nearly 15 years since I had married Babette and my uncle Lazaire's little church. We had sought happiness in our dear valley. I had made myself a farmer. The Durants, my first sweetheart, was now a good mother to me, who seemed to take pleasure in making my fields rich and fertile. Little by little, by following the new methods of agriculture, I became one of the wealthiest landowners in the neighborhood. We had purchased the oak tree walk and the meadows bordering on the river. At the death of my wife's parents, I had a modest house built on this land. We were soon obliged to enlarge it. Each year I found a means of rounding off our property by the addition of some neighboring field, and our granaries were too small for our harvest. Those first 15 years were uneventful and happy. They passed away in serene joy, and all that they had left within me is a remembrance of calm and continued happiness. My uncle Lazaire, on retiring to our home, had realized his dream. His advanced age did not permit of his reading his breviary of a morning. He sometimes regretted his dear church, but consoled himself by visiting the young vicar who had succeeded him. He came down from a little room he occupied at sunrise, and often accompanied me to the fields, enjoying himself in the open air, and finding a second youth amidst the healthy atmosphere of the country. One sadness alone made us sometimes sigh. Amidst the fruitfulness by which we were surrounded, Babette remained childless. Although we were three to love one another, we sometimes found ourselves too much alone. We would have liked to have had a little fair head running about amongst us, who would have tormented and caressed us. Uncle Lazaire had a frightful dread of dying before he was a great uncle. He had become a child again, and felt sorrowful that Babette did not give him a comrade who would have played with him. On the day when my wife confided to us with hesitation that we would no doubt soon be four, I saw my uncle turn quite pale, and made efforts not to cry. He kissed us, thinking already of the christening, and speaking of the child as if we were already 3 or 4 years old. And the months passed in concentrated tenderness, and we walked together in subdued voices, awaiting someone. I no longer loved Babette. I worshipped her with joined hands. I worshipped her for two, from herself and the little one. The great day was drawing nigh. I had brought a midwife from Grenoble, who never moved from the farm. My uncle was in a dreadful fright. He understood nothing about such things. He went so far as to tell me as he had done wrong in taking holy orders, that he was very sorry he was not a doctor. One morning in September, at 6 o'clock, I went into the room of my dear Babette, who was still asleep. Her smiling face was peacefully reposing on a little white linen case. I bent over her, holding my breath. Heaven had blessed me with the good things of this world. I all at once thought of that summer day when I was moaning in the dust, and at the same time I felt around me the comfort due to labor and the quietude that comes from happiness. My good wife was asleep, all rosy in the middle of her great bed, whilst the whole room recalled to me our 15 years of tender affection. I kissed Babette softly on the lips. She opened her eyes and smiled at me without speaking. I felt an almost uncontrollable desire to take her in my arms and clasp her to my heart, but laterally I hardly dared to press her hand. She seemed so fragile and sacred to me. I seated myself at the edge of the bed and asked her in a low voice, "Is it for today?" "No, I don't think so," she replied. I dreamt I had a boy. He was already very tall and wore adorable little black mustachios. Uncle Lazaire told me yesterday that he also had seen him in a dream. I acted very stupidly. "I know the child better than you do," I said. "I see it every night. It's a girl." And as Babette turned her face to the wall, ready to cry, I realized how foolish I had been, and hastened to add, "When I say a girl, I'm not quite sure. I see a very small child with a long white gown. It's certainly a boy." Babette kissed me for that pleasing remark. Go and look after the vintage, she continued. I feel calm this morning. You will send for me if anything happens. Yes, yes. I am very tired. I shall go to sleep again. You will not be angry with me for my laziness. Amabet closed her eyes, looking languid and affected. I remained leaning over her, receiving the warm breath of her lips in my face. She gradually went off to sleep without ceasing to smile. Then I disengaged my hand from hers. In a multitude of precautions, I had to maneuver for 5 minutes to bring this delicate task to a happy issue. After that, I gave her a kiss on the forehead, which she did not feel, and withdrew with a palpitating heart, overflowing with love. In the courtyard below, I found my uncle Lazare, who was gazing anxiously at the window of Babette's room. So soon as he perceived me, he inquired, "Well, is it today?" He had been putting the question to me regularly every morning for the past month. "It appears not," I answered him. "Will you come to me and see them picking the grapes?" He fetched his stick, and we went down the oak tree walk. When we were at the end of it, on the terrace which overlooks the Durance, both of us stopped, gazing at the valley. Small white clouds floated in the pale sky. The sun was shedding soft rays, which cast a sort of gold dust over the country, the yellow expanse of which spread over all ripe. One saw neither the brilliant light nor the dark shadows of summer. The foliage gilded the black earth in large patches. The river ran more slowly, weary at the task of having rendered the fields fruitful for a season, and the valley remained calm and strong. It already wore the first furrows of winter, but it preserved within it the warmth of its last labor, displaying its robust charms, free from the weeds of spring, more majestically beautiful, like that second youth of woman who has given birth to life. My uncle Azare remained silent, then turning towards me, said, "Do you remember, Jean? It's been 20 years ago since I brought you here, early one May morning. On that particular day I showed you the valley full of feverish activity, laboring for the fruits of autumn. Look, the valley has just performed its task again." "I remember, my dear uncle," I replied. "I was quaking with fear on that day. But you were good, and your lesson was convincing. I owe you all my happiness. Yes, you have reached the autumn. You have labored, and you are gathering in the harvest. Man, my boy was created after uh, the way of the earth, and we, like the common mother, are eternal. The green leaves are born again, each year from dry leaves. I am born again in you, and you will be born again in your children. I am telling you this so that old age may not alarm you, so that you may know how to die in peace, as dies this verdure, which will shoot out again from its own germs next spring." I listened to my uncle, and thought of Babette, who was sleeping in her great bed, spread with white linen. The dear creature was about to give birth to a child, after the manner of this fertile soil which had given us fortune. She also had reached the autumn. She had the beaming smile and serene robustness of the valley. I seemed to see her beneath the yellow sun, tired and happy, experiencing noble delight at being a mother, and I no longer knew whether my uncle Lazare was talking to me of my dear valley or of my dear Babette. We slowly ascended the hills below, along the Durance, where the meadows, broad, raw, green swards. Next came the yellow fields, intersected here and there by the grayish olive and slender almond trees, planted wide apart in rows. Then right above were the vines, great stumps, with shoots trailing along the ground. The vine is treated in the south of France like a hardy housewife, but not like a delicate young lady, as in the north. It grows somewhat as it likes, according to the good will of rain and sun. The stumps, which are planted in double rows, and form long lines, throw sprays of dark verdure around them. Wheat or oats are sown between. A vineyard resembles an immense piece of striped material, made of the green bands formed by the vine leaves, and of yellow ribbon represented by the stubble. Men and women, stooping down along the vines, were cutting the benches of grapes. which they then threw to the bottom of the large baskets. My uncle and I walked slowly through the stubble. As we passed along, the vintagers turned their heads and greeted us. My uncle sometimes stopped to speak to some of the oldest of the laborers. "Hey, Father Andre," he said, "are the grapes thoroughly ripe? Will the vine be good this year?" And the country folk, raising their bare arms, displayed the long bunches, which were as black as ink in the sun. And when the grapes were pressed, they seemed to burst with abundance and strength. "Look, Mr. Cure," they exclaimed, "these are small ones. These are some weighing several pounds. We have not had such a task in these 10 years." They then returned among the leaves. Their brown jackets formed patches in the verdure, and the women, bareheaded, with small blue handkerchiefs rounded their necks, was stooping down singing. There were children rolling in the sun, in the stubble, giving utterance to shrill laughter and enlivening this open-air workshop with turbulency. Large carts remained motionless at the edge of the field waiting for the grapes. They stood out prominently against the clear sky, whilst men went and came unceasingly, carrying away full baskets and bringing back empty ones. I confess that in the center of the field I had a feeling of pride. I heard the ground producing beneath my feet. Ripe age ran all-powerful in the veins of the vine, and loaded the air with great puffs of it. Hot blood coursed in my flesh. I was as if elated by the fecundity overflowing from the soil and ascending within me. The labor of this swarm of work-people was my doing. These vines were my children. This entire farm became my large and obedient family. I experienced pleasure in feeling my feet sink into the heavy land. Then at a glance, I took in the fields that sloped down to the Drance, and I was the possessor of those vines, those meadows, that stubble, those olive trees. The house stood all the while beside the oak tree walk. The river seemed like a fringe of silver placed at the edge of the great green mantle of my pasture land. I fancied for a moment that my frame was increasing in size, that by stretching out my arms I would be able to embrace the entire property and press it to my breast, trees, meadows, house, and plowed land. And as I looked, I saw one of our servant girls racing, out of breath, up the narrow pathway that ascended the hill, confused by the speed at which she was traveling. She stumbled over the stones, agitating both her arms and hailing us with gestures of bewilderment. I felt choking with inexpressible emotion. "Uncle, uncle," I shouted, "look how Margaret's running. I think it must be today." My uncle Azaire turned quite pale. The servant had at length reached the plateau. She came toward us, jumping over the vines. When she reached me, she was out of breath. She was stifling and pressing her hands to her bosom. "Speak," I said to her. "What has happened?" She heaved a heavy sigh, agitating her hands, and finally was able to pronounce a single word. "Madame." I waited for no more. Come quick, Uncle Azaire. Ah, my poor dear Babette." And I bounded down the pathway at a pace fit to break my bones. The vintagers who had stood up smiled as they saw me running. Uncle Azaire, who could not overtake me, shook his walking stick in despair. "Hey, Jean, the deuce," he shouted. "Wait for me. I don't want to be the last." But I no longer heard Uncle Azaire and continued running. I reached the farm panting for breath. Full of hope and terror, I rushed upstairs and knocked with my fist at Babette's door, laughing and crying and half crazy. The midwife set the door ajar to tell me in an angry voice not to make so much noise. I stood there abashed and in despair. "You can't come in," she added. "Go and wait in the courtyard." I did not move. She continued, "All is going on very well. I will call you." The door was closed. I remained standing before it, unable to make up my mind to go away. I heard Babette complaining in a broken voice, and while I was there, she gave utterance to a heart-rending scream that struck me right in the breast like a bullet. I felt an almost irresistible desire to break the door open with my shoulder. so as not to give way to it. I placed my hands to my ears and dashed downstairs. In the courtyard, I found my uncle Lazaire, who had just arrived out of breath. The worthy man was obliged to seat himself on the brink of the well. "Hello, where is the child?" he inquired of me. "I don't know," I answered. They shut the door in my face. Babette is in pain, and in tears. We gazed at one another, not daring to utter a word. We listened in agony, without taking our eyes off Babette's windows, endeavoring to see through the little white curtains. My uncle, who was trembling, stood still, with both his hands resting heavily on his walking stick. I, feeling very feverish, walked up and down before him, taking long strides. At times we exchanged anxious smiles. The carts of the vintagers arrived one by one. The baskets of grapes were placed against a wall up in the courtyard. The bare-legged men trampled the bunches under foot in wooden troughs. The mules neighed. The carters swore, whilst the wine fell and the dull sound of the bottom of the vat. Acrid smells pervaded the warm air, and I continued pacing up and down, as if I made tipsy by those perfumes. My poor head was breaking, and as I watched the red juice run from the grapes, I thought of Babette. I said to myself with a manly joy that my child was born at a prolific time of vintage, amidst the perfume of a new wine. I was tormented by impatience. I went upstairs again, but I did not dare knock. I pressed my ear against the door and heard Babette's low moans and sobs. Then my heart failed me, and I cursed suffering. Uncle Lazaire, who had crept up behind me, had to lead me back to the courtyard. He wished to divert me. She told me that the wine would be excellent, but he spoke without attending to what he said. At times we were both silent, listened anxiously to one of Babette's more prolonged moans. Little by little the cries subsided and became nothing more than a painful murmur, like the voice of a child falling off to sleep in tears. Then there was absolute silence. This soon caused me unutterable terror. The house seemed empty, now that Babette had ceased sobbing. I was just going upstairs when the midwife opened the window noiselessly. She leaned out and beckoned me with her hand. "Come," she said to me. I went slowly upstairs, feeling additional delight at each step I took. My uncle Lazaire was already knocking at the door, whilst I was only halfway up the landing, experiencing a sort of strange delight in delaying the moment when I would kiss my wife. I stopped on the threshold. My heart was beating double. My uncle had leaned over the cradle. Babette, quite pale, with closed eyelids, seemed asleep. I forgot all about the child. I was going straight to Babette, took her dear hand between mine. The tears had not dried on her cheeks, and her quivering lips were dripping with them. She raised her eyelids wearily. She did not speak to me, but I understood her to say, "I have suffered a great deal, my dear Jean, but I was so happy to suffer. I felt you within me." And I bent down and kissed Babette's eyes and drank her tears. She laughed with much sweetness, and she resigned herself with a caressing languidness. The fatigue had made her all aches and pains. She slowly moved her hands from the sheet, and taking me by the neck, placed her lips to my ear. "It's a boy," she murmured in a weak voice, with an air of triumph. Those were the first words she uttered after the terrible shock she had undergone. "I knew it would be a boy," she continued. "I saw the child every night. Give him me. Put him beside me." I turned round and saw the midwife and my uncle quarrelling. The midwife had all the trouble in the world to prevent Uncle Lazaire taking the little one in his arms. He wanted to nurse it. I looked at the child whom the mother had made me forget. He was all rosy. Babette said with conviction that he was like me. The midwife discovered that he had his mother's eyes. I, for my part, could not say. I was almost crying. I smothered the dear little thing with kisses, imagining I was still kissing Babette. I placed the child on the bed. He kept on crying, but this sounded to us like celestial music. I sat on the edge of the bed. My uncle took a large armchair, and Babette, weary and serene, covered up to her chin, remained with open eyelids and smiling eyes. The window was wide open. The smell of grapes came in along with the warmth of the mild autumn afternoon. One heard the trampling of the vintagers, the shocks of the carts, the cracking of whips. At times the shrill song of a servant working in the courtyard reached us. All this noise was softened in the serenity of that room, which still resounded with Babette's sobs, and the window frame enclosed a large strip of landscape, carved out of the heavens and open country. We could see the oak tree walk in the entire length, and the Durance, looking like a white satin ribbon, passed amidst the gold and purple leaves, whilst among this square of ground were the limpid depths of the pale sky with blue and rosy tints. It was amidst the calm of this horizon, amidst the exhaltations of the vat and joys attendant upon labor and reproduction, that we three talked together, Babette, Uncle Lazare, and myself, whilst gazing at the dear little newborn babe. Uncle Lazare, said Babette, what name will you give the child? Jean Mother's was named Jacqueline, answered my uncle. I shall call the child Jacques. Jacques. Jacques, replied Babette. Yes, it's a pretty name. And tell me, what shall we make the little man, parson or soldier, gentleman or peasant? I began to laugh. We shall have time to think of it, I said. But no, continued Babette, almost angry. We will grow rapidly. See how strong he is. He already speaks with his eyes. My uncle Lazare was exactly of my wife's opinion. He answered in a very grave tone, make him neither priest nor soldier, unless he have an irresistible inclination for one of those callings. To make him a gentleman would be a serious. Babette looked at me anxiously. The dear creature had not a bit of pride for herself, but like all mothers, she would have liked to be humble and proud before her son. I could have sworn that she already saw him, a notary or a doctor. I kissed her and gently said to her, I wish our son to live in our dear valley one day. You will find a Babette of 16 on the banks of the Durance, to whom he will give some water. Do you remember, my dear? The country has brought us peace. Our son shall be a peasant as we are, and happy as we are. Babette, who was quite touched, kissed me in her turn. She gazed at the foliage in the river, in the meadows and the sky, and through the window she said to me, smiling, you are right, Jean. This place has been good to us. It will be the same to our little Jacques. Uncle Lazare, you will be the godfather of a farmer. Uncle Lazare made a languid, affectionate sign of approval with his head. I had been examining him for a moment, and saw his eyes becoming filmy, and his lips turning pale. Leaning back in the armchair opposite the window, he had placed his white hands on his knees, and was watching the heavens fixedly with an expression of thoughtful ecstasy. I felt very anxious. Are you in pain, Uncle Lazare? I inquired of him. What's the matter with you? Answer, for mercy's sake. He gently raised one of his hands, as if to beg me to speak lower. Then he let it fall again, and said in a weak voice, I am broken down, he said. Happiness, at my age, is mortal. Don't make a noise. It seems as if my flesh were becoming quite light. I can no longer feel my legs or arms. Babette raised herself in alarm, with her eyes on Uncle Lazare. I knelt down before him, watching him anxiously. He smiled. Don't be frightened, he resumed. I am in no pain. A feeling of calmness is gaining possession of me. I believe I am going off into a good and just sleep. It came over me all at once, and I thank the Almighty. Ah, my poor Jean. I ran too fast down the pathway on the hillside. The child caused me too much joy. As we understood, we burst out into tears. Uncle Lazare continued, without ceasing to watching the sky. Do not spoil my joy, I beg of you. If you only knew how happy it makes me to fall asleep forever in this armchair. I have never dared to expect such a consoling death. All I love is here beside me. And see what a blue sky. The Almighty has sent me a lovely evening. The sun was sinking beneath the oak tree walk. Its slanting rays cast sheets of gold beneath the trees, which took the tones of old copper. The verdant fields melted into a vague serenity in the distance. Uncle Azaire became weaker and weaker amidst the touching silence of this peaceful sunset. Entering by the open window, he slowly passed away, like those slight gleams that were dying out on the lofty branches. "Ah, my good valley," he murmured, "you are sending me a tender farewell. I was afraid of coming to the end of the winter, when you would be all black." We restrained our tears, not wishing to trouble his saintly death. Babette prayed in an undertone. The child continued uttering smothered cries. My uncle Azaire heard his wail in the dreaminess of his agony. He endeavored to turn towards Babette, and still smiling, said, "I have seen the child, and die very happy." Then he gazed at the pale sky and yellow fields, and throwing back his head, heaved a gentle sigh. No tremor agitated Uncle Lazaire's body. He died as one falls asleep. He had become so calm that we remained silent and with dry eyes in the presence of such great simplicity in death. All we experienced was feeling of serene sadness. Twilight had set in. Uncle Lazaire's farewell had left us confident, like the farewell of the sun which dies at night, to be born again in the morning. Such was my autumn day, which gave me a son, and carried off my uncle Azaire in the peacefulness of the twilight. Winter. There are dreadful mornings in January that chill one's heart. I woke on this particular day with a vague feeling of anxiety. It had thawed during the night, and when I cast my eyes over the country from the threshold, it looked to me like an immense dirty gray rag, soiled with mud and rent to tatters. The horizon was shrouded in a certain fog, in which the oak trees along the walk lugubriously extended their dark arms, like a row of spectres guarding the vast mass of vapor spreading out behind them. The fields had sunk, and were covered with great sheets of water, at the edge of which hung the remnants of dirty snow. The loud roar of the Durance was increasing in the distance. Winter imparts health and strength to one's frame, and when the sun is clear and the ground dry, the air makes the tips of your ears tingle. You walk merrily along the frozen pathways, which ring with a silvery sound beneath your tread. But I know of nothing more saddening than dull, thawing weather. I hate the damp fogs which weigh one's shoulders down. I shivered in the presence of that copper-like sky, and hastened to retire indoors, making up my mind that I would not go out into the fields that day. There were plenty of work in and around the farm buildings. Jacques had been up for a long time. I heard him whistling in the shed, where he was helping some men remove sacks of corn. The boy was already 18 years old. He was a tall fellow with strong arms. He had not had an uncle Lazare to spoil him and teach him Latin, and did not go and dream beneath the willows of the riverside. Jacques had become a real peasant, an untiring worker, who got angry when I touched anything, and telling me I was getting old and ought to rest. And I was watching him from a distance, a sweet, lithe creature, leaping on my shoulders, clapping her little hands to my eyes, inquiring, "Who is it?" I laughed and answered, "It's little Marie, who has just been dressed by her mamma." The dear little girl was completing her 10th year, and for 10 years she had been the delight of the farm, having come the last at a time when we could no longer hope to have any more children. She was doubly loved. Her precarious health made her particularly dear to us. She was treated as a young lady. Her mother absolutely wanted to make a lady of her, and I had not the heart to oppose her wish, so little Marie was a pet, in lovely silk skirts trimmed with ribbons. Marie was still seated on my shoulders. "Mamma, mamma," she cried, "come and look. I'm playing at horses." Babette, who was entering, smiled. Ah, my poor Babette, how old we were. I remember we were shivering with weariness on that day, gazing sadly at one another when alone. Our children brought back our youth. Lunch was eaten in silence. We had been compelled to light the lamp. The reddish glimmer that hung around the room was sad enough to drive one crazy. Bah, said Jacques. This tepid, rainy weather is better than intense cold that would freeze our vines and olives. And he tried to joke, but he was as anxious as we were, without knowing why. Babette had bad dreams. We listened to the account of her nightmare, laughing with our lips, but sad at heart. This weather quite upsets one, I said to cheer us all up. Yes, it's the weather, Jacques hastened to add. I'll put some vine branches on the fire. There was a bright flame which cast large sheets of light upon the walls. The branches burnt with a cracking sound, leaving rosy ashes. We had seated ourselves in front of the chimney. The air outside was tepid, and the great drops of icy cold damp fell from the ceiling outside the farmhouse. Babette had taken little Marie on her knees. She had talked to her in an undertone, amused at her childish chatter. Are you coming, father? Jacques inquired of me. We were going to look at the cellars and lofts. I went out with him. The harvest had been getting bad for some years past. We were suffering great losses. Our vines and trees were caught by frost. Will's hail had chopped up our wheat and oats, and I sometimes said that I was growing old, and that Fortune, who is a woman, does not care for old men. Jacques laughed, answering that he was young and was going to court Fortune. I had reached the winter, the cold season. I felt distinctively that all was withering around me. At each pleasure that departed, I thought of Uncle Lazare, who had died so calmly, and with fond remembrances of him, asked for strength. Daylight had completely disappeared at 3 o'clock. We went down into the common room. Babette was sewing in the chimney corner, with her head bent over her work, and little Marie was seated on the ground in front of the fire, gravely dressing a doll. Jacques and I placed ourselves at a mahogany writing table, which had come to us from our Uncle Lazare, and were engaged in checking our accounts. The window was as blocked up, the fog, sticking to the panes of glass, formed a perfect wall of gloom. Behind this wall stretched emptiness, unknown, a great noise. A loud roar alone arose in silence and spread through the obscurity. We had dismissed the workplace. We had dismissed the work people, keeping only our old woman servant, Margaret, with us. When I raised my head and listened, it seemed to me that the farmhouse hung suspended in the middle of a chasm. No human sound came from the outside. I heard not, but the riot of the abyss. Then I gazed at my wife and children, experienced the cowardice of these people who feel themselves too weak to protect those surroundings them against unknown peril. The noise became harsher, and it seemed to us that they were knocking at the door. At the same instant, the horses in the stable began to neigh furiously, while the cattle lowed as if choking. We had all risen, pale with anxiety. Jacques dashed to the door and threw it wide open. A wave of muddy water burst into the room. The Durance was overflowing. It was it that had been making the noise. It had been increasing in the distance since morning. The snow melting on the mountains had transformed each hillside into a torrent which had swelled the river. The curtain of fog had hidden from us this sudden rise of water. It often advanced thus to the gates of the farm when the thaw came after severe winters, but the flood had never increased so rapidly. We could see through the open door that the courtyard was transformed into a lake. The water already reached our ankles. Babette had caught up little Marie, who was crying and clasping her doll to her. Jacques wanted to run and open the doors of the stables and cowhouses, but his mother held him back by his clothes, begging him not to go out. The water continued rising. I pushed Babette towards the staircase. Quick, let us go. Up into the bedrooms, I cried. and I obliged Jacques to pass before me. I left the ground floor in the last. Marguerite came down in terror from the loft where she had happened to find herself. I made her sit down at the end of the room beside Babette, who remained silent, pale, and with beseeching eyes. We put little Marie into bed. She had insisted on keeping her doll, and was quiet to sleep, pressing it into her arms. This child's sleep relieved me. When I turned round and saw Babette listening to the little girl's regular breathing, I forgot the danger. All I heard was the water beating against the walls. But Jacques and I could not help looking the peril in the face. Anxiety made us endeavor to discover the progress of the inundation. We had thrown the window open. We leaned out at the risk of falling, searching into the darkness. The fog, which was thicker, hung above the flood, throwing out fine rain, which gave us the shivers. Vague steel-like flashes where all showed the moving sheet of water. Amidst the profound obscurity, below was splashing in the courtyard, rising along the walls of gentle undulations, and we still heard not but the anger of the Durants and the affrighted cattle and horses. The neighing was lowing, and these poor beasts pierced me to the heart. Jacques questioned me with his eyes. He would have liked to try and deliver them. Their agonizing moans soon became lamentable, and a great cackling sound was heard. The oxen had just broken down the stable doors. We saw them pass before us, borne away by the flood, rolled over and over in the current, and they disappeared amid the roar of the river. Then I felt choking with anger. I became as one possessed. I shook my fist at the Durants, erect, facing the window. I insulted it. Wicked thing, I shouted amidst the tumult of the waters. I loved you fondly, and you were my first sweetheart, and now you are plundering me. You come and disturb my farm, and carry off my cattle. Ah, cursed thing. Then you gave me Babette. You ran gently at the edge of my meadows. I took you for a good mother. I remembered Uncle Lazare felt affection for your limpid stream, and I thought I owed you gratitude. You are a barbarous mother. I owe only you my hatred. But the Durance stifled my cries with his thundering voice, and broad and indifferent, expanded and drove its flood onward with tranquil obstinacy. I turned back to the room and went and kissed Babette, who was weeping. Little Marie was smiling in her sleep. Don't be afraid, I said to my wife. The water cannot always rise. It will certainly go down. There is no danger. No, there is no danger, Jacques repeated, feverishly. The house is solid. At that moment, Marguerite, who had approached the window, tormented by the feeling of curiosity, which is the outcome of fear, leaned forward like a mad thing and fell, uttering a cry. I threw myself before the window, but could not prevent Jacques plunging into the water. Marguerite had nursed him, and he felt the tenderness of a son for a poor woman. Babette, who had risen in terror with joined hands at the sound of the two splashes, she remained there, erect, with open mouth and distant eyes, watched the window. I seated myself on the wooden handrail, and my ears were ringing with the roar of the flood. I do not know how long it was that Babette and I were in this painful state of stupor, when a voice called to me. It was Jacques, who was holding on the wall beneath the window. I stretched out my hand to him, and he clambered up. Babette clasped him in her arms. She could sob now, and she relieved herself. No reference was made to Marguerite. Jacques did not dare say he had been unable to find her, and we did not dare question him anew his search. He took me apart and brought me back to the window. Father, he said to me in an undertone, there are more than 7 feet of water in the courtyard, and the river is still rising. We cannot remain here any longer. Jacques was right. The house was falling to pieces, and the planks of the outbuildings were going away one by one. When this death of Marguerite weighed upon us, Babette, bewildered, was beseeched us. Marie alone remained peaceful in the big bed, with her doll between her arms, slumbering with the happy smile of an angel. The peril increased at every minute. The water was on the point of reaching the handrail of the window and pouring into the room. Anyone would have said that it was an engine of war, making the farmhouse totter with regular dull, hard blows. The current must be running right against the facade, and we could not hope for any human assistance. Every minute is precious, said Jacques in agony. We shall be crushed beneath the ruins. Let us look for boards, let us make a raft. He said that in his excitement. I would naturally have preferred it 1,000 times to be in the middle of the river, on a few beams lashed together, that beneath the roof of his house, which was about to fall in. But there we could lay hands on the beams we required. In a rage, I tore the planks from the cupboards. Jacques broke the furniture. We took away the shutters, every piece of the wood we could reach. In feeling it was impossible to utilize these fragments, we cast them into the middle of the room in fury, and continued searching. Our last hope was departing. We understood our misery and want of power. The water was rising. The harsh voice of the Durants was calling to us in anger. And I burst out sobbing. I took Babette in my trembling arms. I begged Jacques to come near us. I wished us all to die in the same embrace. Jacques had returned to the window, and suddenly he exclaimed, "Father, we are saved. Come and see." The sky was clear. The roof of our shed, torn away by the current, had come to a standstill beneath our window. Its roof, which was several yards broad, had formed of light beams and thatch. It floated and would make a capital raft. I joined my hands together and would have worshipped this wood and straw. Jacques jumped on the roof. After having firmly secured it, he walked on the thatch, making sure it was everywhere strong. The thatch resisted, and therefore we could adventure on it without fear. "Oh, it will carry us very well," said Jacques joyfully. "See how little it sinks into the water. The difficulty will be to steer it." He looked around him and seized 2 poles drifting along the current, and they passed by. "Here are the oars," he continued. "You will go to the stern, father, and I forward, and we will maneuver the raft easily. There are not 12 feet of water. Quick, quick, get on board. We must not lose a minute." My poor Babette tried to smile. She wrapped little Marie carefully up in her shawl. The child had just woke up, and quite alarmed, maintained a silence which had broken up by little sobs, deep sobs. I placed a chair before the window and made Babette get on the raft. As I held her in my arms, I kissed her with poignant emotion. Feeling this kiss was the last. The water was beginning to pour into the room. Our feet were soaking. I was the last to embark. Then I undid the cord. The current hurled us against the wall. It required precautions and many efforts to quit the farmhouse. The fog had little by little dispersed. It was about midnight when we left. The stars were still buried in mist. The moon, which was almost at the edge of the horizon, lit up the night. We sort of won daylight. The inundation then appeared to us in all its grandiose horror. The valley had become a river, the Durants swollen to enormous proportions, washing the 2 hillsides, passed between dark masses of cultivated land, and was the sole thing displayed life in the inanimate space bounded by the horizon. It thundered with a sovereign voice, maintaining in its anger the majesty of its colossal wave. Clumps of trees emerged in places, staining the sheet of pale water with black streaks. Opposite us I recognized the tops of the oaks along the walk. The current carried us towards these branches, which for us were so many reefs. Around the raft floated various kinds of remains, pieces of wood, empty barrels, bundles of grass. The river was bearing along the ruins, and it had made in its anger. To the left we perceived the lights of the Dourges, flashes of lanterns moving about the darkness. The water could not have risen as high as the village. Only the low land had been submerged. No doubt assistance would come. We searched the patches of light hanging over the water. It seemed to us every instant that we heard the sound of oars. We had started at random. As soon as the raft was in the middle of the current, we lost amidst the whirlpools of the water. Anguish of mind overtook us again. We almost regretted having left the farm. I sometimes turned round and gazed at the house, which still remained standing, presenting a gray aspect of the white water. Babette crouching down in the center of the raft, in the thatch of the roof, was holding little Marie on her knees, the child's head against her breast to hide the horror of the river from her. Both were bent double, leaning forward in an embrace, as if reduced in stature by fear. Jacques, standing upright in the front, was leaning on his pole with all his weight. From time to time he cast a rapid glance toward us, and then silently resumed his task. I seconded him as well as I could, but our efforts to reach the bank remained fruitless. Little by little, notwithstanding our poles, which we buried into the mud until we nearly broke them, we drifted into the open. A force that seemed to come from the depths of the water drove us away. The Durance was slowly taking possession of us. Struggling, bathed in perspiration, we had worked ourselves into a passion. We were fighting with the river as a living being, seeking to vanquish, wound, and kill it. It strained us in its giant-like arms, and our poles in our hands became weapons which we thrust into its breast. It roared, flung us into slaver, into our faces, wriggled beneath our strokes. We resisted its victory with clenched teeth. We would not be conquered, and we had made impulses to fell the monster, to calm it with blows from our fists. We went slowly towards the offing. We're already at the entrance of the oak tree walk. The dark branches pierced through the water, which they tore with lamentable sound. Death perhaps awaited us there in a collision. I cried out to Jacques to follow the walk by clinging close to the branches. As it was thus I passed for the last time in the middle of the oak tree alley, where I had walked in my youth and ripe age. In the terrible darkness, above the howling depth, I thought of Uncle Azaire and saw the happy days of my youth smiling at me sadly. The Durance triumphed at the end of the alley. Our poles no longer touched the bottom. The water bore us along in its impetuous bound of victory, and now I could do what it pleased with us. We gave ourselves up. We went downstream with frightful rapidity. Gray clouds, dirty, tattered rags hung about the sky. When the moon was hidden, there came lugubrious obscurity. Then we rolled in chaos. Enormous billows, as black as ink, resembling the backs of fish, bore us along, spinning us round. I could no longer see either Babette or the children. I already felt myself dying. I know not how long this last run lasted. The moon was suddenly unveiled, and the horizon became clear, and in that light I perceived an immense black mass in front of us, which blocked the way, and towards which we were being carried with all the violence of the current. We were lost. We would be taken there. Babette had stood upright. She held out little Marie to me. "Take the child," she exclaimed. "Leave me alone, leave me alone." Jacques had already caught Babette in his arms. In a loud voice he said, "Father, save the little one. I will save mother." We had come close to the black mass. I thought I recognized the tree. The shock was terrible, and the raft, split in two, scattered its straw and beams in the whirlpool of water. I fell, clasping little Marie tightly to me. The icy cold water brought back all my courage. On rising to the surface of the water, I supported the child. I half laid her on my neck and began to swim laboriously. If the little creature had lost consciousness, but had struggled, we should have remained at the bottom of the deep. And while I swam, I felt choking with anxiety. I called Jacques. I tried to see in the distance, but I heard nothing to save the roar of the waters. I saw naught but the pale sheet of the Durance. Jacques and Babette were at the bottom. She must have clung to him, dragged him down in the deadly strain of her arms. What frightful agony. I wanted to die. I slunk slowly. I was going to find them beneath the black water. As soon as the flood touched little Marie's face, I struggled again, with impetuous anguish, to get her near the waterside. It was thus that I abandoned Babette and Jacques, in despair at having been unable to die with them, still calling out to them, in a husky voice. The river cast me to the stones, like one of those bundles of grass it leaves on its way. When I came to myself again, I took my daughter, who was opening her eyes, in my arms. Day was breaking. My winter night was at an end. That terrible night, which had been an accomplice in the murder of my wife and son. At this moment, after years of regret, one last consolation remained to me. I am the icy winter, but I feel the approaching spring stirring within me. As my uncle Azare said, we never die. I have had 4 seasons, and here I am returning to the spring. There is my dear Marie commencing the everlasting joys and sorrows over again. And that's the end of Jean Gourdon's 4 Days by Emile Zola. Yeah, I didn't really like that, to be honest. I say this on every video, but I'm trying to find an author who makes short stories that doesn't make action-packed stories. I'm looking for more like a slice of life type short story, and this isn't it. I'm looking for more slice of life, and I'm not getting it from this. So it's really depressing that I'm not finding the authors I'm looking. I mean, it was alright. Parts of it are alright. I liked half the book. The other half of the book I didn't like. I liked the slow parts. I didn't like the exciting parts. It's pretty hard to find the author that I'm looking for exactly that's going to give me what I'm looking for, because I find inadequacies in all these stories, and none of this stuff really satisfies me. So I'm going to keep searching for an author that really piques my interest, because this author, again, it's too much excitement. I want less excitement, more day-to-day life type of deal. It's hard because I'm looking for something boring, but these people keep giving me something exciting. When I was a kid, I liked exciting stuff, but I don't want that anymore. Anyways, let me know in the comments below, what did you think of the 4 seasons, or the 4 days by Jean Gourdon's 4 Days by Emile Zola. Let me know in the comments below what you thought about it. I thought it was alright, but it's not what I'm looking for. Please subscribe to this channel to be part of the community. And please like this video. It really helps out the channel a lot. Thank you for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.